the Mafia king who acts snobby, until the black bartender makes him go weak. Rain pounded against the basement windows of the Velvet Serpent, the exclusive jazz club above hiding its darker reality. A man in a bespoke Italian suit, stained with blood, stood over a bound man. His grey eyes were sharp, calculating, every muscle tense. In his hand, a knife gleamed under the harsh overhead light. The steel door creaked, and she stepped in. 5'9 3/4, her skin the deep hue of polished mahogany, wearing the black uniform of a bartender. She knew this man's reputation. King of a criminal empire that spread from Chicago's Gold Coast into the suburbs and beyond. She should have stayed away. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, the layers of him became visible. There was the cold, ruthless king who demanded obedience and crushed anyone who challenged him. And there was the man who whispered poetry in private, whose vulnerability only she had ever glimpsed. 18 months of invisibility had prepared her for observation, not engagement. Yet she walked toward him. She held knowledge he would kill to protect, and for the first time, his power over her wavered. How did a forensic psychology student end up drawn to the most dangerous man in Chicago? Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe now for stories that explore the edges of desire and danger. Let's begin. Vincenzo Caruso moved through the Velvet Serpent with the ease of a man who owned not just the space but every decision made within it. His presence was magnetic, though cold, and every detail of his appearance broadcast control. The Milanese tailor who visited 4 times a year would have recognized him anywhere. The cut of his suit, the precision of the lapel, the way the fabric fell over his shoulders as if molded to his frame. Handmade shoes from Florence gleamed under the club's lights. A watch from Geneva peeked subtly from beneath his cuff. Even his tie, knotted perfectly, seemed to declare authority without a word. The club itself was a study in refined excess. Situated at the corner of Rush and State Streets, it drew a clientele who appreciated the jazz performances but never questioned why the basement doors were always locked. Velvet drapes absorbed the chatter, polished mahogany reflected the soft glow of strategically placed lights, and the scent of aged bourbon lingered in the air. To an outsider, it was a sanctuary of sophistication, a place where money could buy experience. To those who knew better, it was a throne room where a man decided fates with a glance or a nod. Vincenzo had inherited this empire at 27, when his father, Don Aurelio Caruso, passed unexpectedly during a poker game at the Lake Forest estate. He had taken over the operation with a clarity that left seasoned coppos both in awe and wary of him. Where his father's dealings had been straightforward, gambling, protection, occasional smuggling, Vincenzo's vision expanded. He built legitimate businesses alongside his clandestine ventures. Dealerships for luxury vehicles dotted the city, Italian restaurants stretched from Naperville to Evanston, and real estate developments transformed Pilsen and Logan Square. Each project had a veneer of legitimacy, a public face that kept law enforcement at a careful distance. Beneath that public mask, his operations were complex and meticulous. Money flowed through channels that baffled even experienced auditors. The opioid networks reached suburban neighborhoods with chilling efficiency. Human trafficking, a shadow even some of his own men hesitated to approach, had become a source of quiet power and influence, always kept behind layers of discretion. Each enterprise reinforced the other, building an empire where profit, fear, and respect were inseparable. Vincenzo's demeanor mirrored the precision of his empire. He spoke softly but with authority, his words deliberate. He moved with control, whether selecting a bottle from the cellar, surveying the club, or sitting in his box at the Lyric Opera. Those who worked under him learned quickly, never speak unless addressed. Eye contact beyond a glance invited consequences. Touching him without permission was unthinkable. The rules were clear, and the repercussions were severe enough that rumor alone kept men aligned. The Chicago River was deep, Lake Michigan deeper still, and whispers suggested the fates of those who defied him. Every aspect of his life was curated. Even in private moments, there was an elegance that hinted at obsessive care, a perfectly aligned glass of bourbon, a a folder of accounts arranged by both date and priority, notes made in a system that only he could decipher. Guests at the club saw only a refined man who appreciated culture and artistry. He attended the symphony, held a box at the opera, and donated generously to the Art Institute. Yet behind every act of sophistication was a calculation: power maintained, loyalty enforced, weaknesses identified. Vincenzo's world was a balance of extremes. The public man and the private man occupied the same space, yet rarely intersected. The Velvet Serpent was both stage and sanctuary, a place where one could witness elegance and brutality side by side. His clients and associates recognized this duality but never fully understood it, which made his power absolute. Even in the quieter moments, when the club hummed with muted conversation and jazz brushed softly against the walls, he observed. Every detail mattered: the angle of a chair, the way light reflected from a crystal glass, the cadence of speech from employees and patrons alike. These were not trivial concerns. They were indicators, signals that could reveal loyalty or the lack of it. Vincenzo had learned early that control was maintained through awareness, and awareness required attention to even the smallest details. In this environment, few dared to cross him, and fewer still survived the consequences. Rules were enforced silently but effectively. A missed instruction, an errant word, a hesitation in service, all could lead to outcomes that reinforced the lesson without question. Respect, fear, and discretion maintained the machinery of his empire with precision unmatched in Chicago. This was Vincenzo Caruso, the man who could be both a patron of the arts and a king over a network of crime stretching from the heart of the city into the suburbs and beyond. His presence dominated every space he occupied, yet it was in the subtleties, the sharp glance, the measured pause, the deliberate movements, that the true weight of his authority was revealed. To understand him was to recognize that elegance and danger were not opposites in his world but companions, bound together by discipline, strategy, and a relentless drive to maintain the throne he had inherited and perfected. Celestine Monroe moved through the Velvet Serpent with quiet efficiency, each gesture precise, each motion measured. At 5 feet 9 3/4, her presence was commanding yet unobtrusive. Her skin gleamed like polished mahogany under the club's lighting, and her eyes, deep and attentive, constantly scanned her surroundings, taking in subtle shifts others failed to notice. Patrons and staff alike accepted her as part of the environment, a fixture as permanent as the polished bar counter, yet her mind was never idle. Before this, she had been a graduate student at Northwestern University, pursuing a degree in forensic psychology. Every course, every case study, every late-night analysis of criminal behavior had sharpened her awareness. She could read patterns, anticipate responses, and understand motivations that most would overlook. But life had forced a pivot. Her mother's cancer treatments had drained family resources, and with tuition unpaid, she left the program with a single semester remaining. It had been a sacrifice that burned in her chest, yet she carried no regret. Survival had its own kind of education. 18 months had passed since she began working at the Velvet Serpent, covering Thursday through Sunday nights. At first, the job had been purely functional, a means to an end, a way to pay bills and maintain a semblance of independence. Over time, it became a field of study. Vincenzo Caruso, the man who ruled the city's underworld, was more than a subject for observation. He was a puzzle of contradictions. In her mind, she had constructed a profile of him with clinical precision: narcissistic tendencies, obsessive control, sociopathic patterns. She noted every tick, every calculated movement, every shift in expression that betrayed his inner processes. Yet for all her scrutiny, he had never truly seen her. 18 months had rendered her invisible. She knew his preferred Negroni like the back of her hand, precisely 2 dashes of orange bitters, a twist of blood orange peel stirred, not shaken. Each component mattered, and she delivered it with the kind of instinct honed by repeated practice and careful observation. She understood the delicate balance of recognition and invisibility. To be unseen meant protection. To be noticed could be dangerous. This invisibility suited her perfectly. In a world where the wrong glance, the wrong word, or the misplacement of a drink could draw attention from men with more power than conscience, anonymity was safety. Survival required blending into the background, mastering the art of observation without participation. Her presence was constant but unobtrusive, her intelligence silent but active. She watched, catalogued, and interpreted. Each detail, no matter how minor, was noted and filed for future reference. Despite her caution, she understood the nature of the empire she had stepped into. The Velvet Serpent was a stage of elegance, a performance of wealth and sophistication. Beneath that, decisions were made, deals were struck, and control was exercised with subtle precision. Patrons enjoyed the music, the drinks, and the exclusivity without realizing the depth of the machinery operating just out of sight. Celestine had learned to recognize the signals. The way a hand lingered over a glass too long, the slight hesitation before answering a question, the silent acknowledgement of authority that passed without words. Her observations had led her to recognize cracks in Vincenzo Caruso's carefully maintained persona. Small details that others ignored hinted at pressures he bore privately. When he adjusted the alignment of bottles on the bar or tapped his fingers in particular rhythms, she catalogued it without drawing attention. She noticed the fatigue in his eyes after long meetings, the brief moments when his posture relaxed in ways only someone who watched consistently could detect. These observations were not idle, they shaped her understanding of him, his vulnerabilities, and the patterns that governed his behavior. Even as she worked, Celestine carried a knowledge that demanded caution. She knew the reach of the empire she served, the consequences of exposure, and the risks inherent in every interaction. The awareness was constant, a background pulse that guided every action. She had memorized the flow of staff, the timing of security checks, and the subtle hierarchy that ensured loyalty within the organization. Each piece of knowledge gave her control in small ways, reinforcing the survival skills that had kept her safe since she entered this world. Yet tension lingered. She could sense the potential for change in the man who had never truly looked at her. Though he remained cold and refined in public, small deviations from his usual patterns hinted at a depth unseen by others. The way his hands paused over a glass, the split-second hesitation before addressing a colleague, the quiet intensity of his gaze when he thought no one was observing, all suggested that the carefully constructed image of absolute control was not impermeable. Celestine understood the stakes. Recognition by him could bring consequences she had not encountered before, but it also offered insight, a glimpse into a humanity that few had ever witnessed. The balance between survival and awareness was delicate, and she had mastered it with patience and precision. Every observation, every cocktail prepared to exact specifications, every silent interaction contributed to a tapestry of knowledge that was uniquely hers. She had grown adept at reading him, at predicting his reactions, at maintaining a presence that allowed her to navigate the dangerous currents of the club without drawing notice. But beneath the skill and vigilance, there was a quiet anticipation. Something in the patterns she had tracked for months suggested that the status quo could not last. Small deviations, subtle signals, and rare moments of unguarded expression hinted at an approaching shift. Celestine, attentive and intelligent, sensed that the dynamics between herself and Vincenzo were on the cusp of change. For now, she remained the invisible observer, the skilled bartender, the quiet presence among the polished walls and muted jazz. Yet she understood that her knowledge, her attention, and her patience could become factors in a story that was moving toward collision. Every detail she collected, every rhythm she noticed, and every subtle divergence from routine prepared her for the moment when visibility would no longer be optional, when observation would become engagement, and when the man she had studied with clinical detachment might see her in a way no one else had. The first Tuesday of October brought an unseasonable warmth to Chicago. The city felt lethargic under the low sun, streets slick from a late afternoon rain. Celestine had picked up an extra shift at the Velvet Serpent to cover for a colleague whose child was ill. The club was quieter than usual, the soft hum of conversation punctuated only by the gentle clinking of glasses and the occasional sigh from patrons lost in the music. It gave the space a fragile stillness, as though the night itself was holding its breath. She moved behind the bar with practiced precision, polishing glassware and lining up bottles, her mind divided between the usual attentiveness to her surroundings and the pressing worry about her mother's upcoming scan results. For months, she had observed Vincenzo Caruso from a distance, cataloging habits, movements, and small details that revealed the man behind the empire. Tonight, she remained in her familiar rhythm, expecting nothing to disrupt it. Then she noticed him. He was standing at the bar. Not seated as usual, not leaning with casual dominance, standing, as though the weight of the city rested on his shoulders. Her pulse quickened. The man before her was familiar in appearance yet different. His tie, normally pristine, hung loosely around his neck. A few strands of dark hair fell across his forehead, displacing the meticulous image he always projected. His eyes, sharp and commanding in public, were red-rimmed, as if sleepless nights and private turmoil had left their mark. He raised a hand, shaking slightly, and reached for a bottle. The first glass of bourbon disappeared in a single swallow. He paused, his hand trembling as he placed the glass back on the polished counter. He took a second pour, and then a third, each consumed with a desperation that made Celestine hesitate. The man who had always exuded precision now appeared vulnerable, almost human in a way that unsettled her. Finally, instinct overcame caution. "Respectfully," she said, her voice calm but firm, "whatever it is, the bourbon isn't going to fix it." The words hung in the quiet air. He froze. For a moment, the entire club seemed suspended. The silence was suffocating. Celestine had no plan for what she had done. Speaking to Vincenzo Caruso directly, interrupting him, had never been considered an option. Yet she did not retreat. Her eyes met his, unwavering, as the layers of control began to peel away. His mask faltered. The precise, measured authority that he wore like armor cracked under the weight of personal grief. His voice, usually steady and controlled, broke. "My sister," he whispered, almost inaudibly. "She was found this morning. In her apartment in Lincoln Park. She had been gone for 3 days before anyone checked on her." Celestine felt her chest tighten. Juliana, his sister, a woman whose struggles had been known in quiet family circles, now became an undeniable part of his world. The cold, untouchable Vincenzo, the man who dictated life and death for his empire, stood exposed, consumed by loss. The contrast was staggering. He sank slightly, one hand covering his face, the other resting heavily on the counter. The trembling that had begun with the drinks continued, subtle but unrelenting. Celestine moved closer, instinct compelling her to witness, to remain present, even though every lesson in survival screamed that she should step back. For 18 months, she had observed him as a mystery, a subject of analysis, a figure who demanded distance. Tonight, the calculations of behavior and control were irrelevant. She watched a man confront grief without pretense, a man whose empire and reputation could not shield him from the rawness of loss. She did not speak further. Words would have been inadequate. Instead, she poured a fresh glass of bourbon and slid it across to him. His hand, steady for the first time in weeks, hesitated before accepting it. The act was simple, almost mundane, yet in that moment, it was profoundly human. Vincenzo exhaled, a sound that carried weight far beyond the room. He spoke of Juliana, not in fragments or coded statements, but in the raw truth of her life and his failures to protect her. He told of her battles with depression, her quiet struggles that had gone unnoticed, the gaps in their family where understanding had failed. His voice shook occasionally, but each word was deliberate, measured in its honesty. Celestine understood with sudden clarity that this man, the king of an empire that stretched from the Gold Coast to the suburbs, was capable of grief that neither diminished nor excused his other actions. It existed alongside his ruthlessness, not in place of it. Witnessing this vulnerability did not humanize him entirely. It complicated him, added depth to a figure she had thought she understood through observation alone. The night stretched on. Patrons came and went, unaware of the quiet unraveling at the bar. Celestine remained, attentive, offering what comfort could exist in silence. The rhythm of her presence, the steady efficiency of her hands as she prepared drinks, became a counterpoint to the storm of emotion in front of her. By the time the night waned, the unseasonable warmth had shifted to a crisp chill, signaling the approach of true October. Vincenzo had returned, in part, to the precision and control that defined him, but the fracture was evident to Celestine. She had seen a version of him that few, if any, would witness. The monster who commanded an empire and the man capable of private grief now coexisted visibly, and she understood the precarious balance between the two. Her observation was no longer purely analytical. It carried weight, consequence, and a dawning recognition of how fragile control could be, even for a man like Vincenzo Caruso. And while she remained behind the bar, the quiet understanding settled between them. Boundaries had shifted, and the rules that had governed their interactions were evolving, though neither could yet articulate the full extent of what was to come. The weeks that followed the night in October shifted the rhythm of the Velvet Serpent in ways few noticed. Vincenzo Caruso's presence became more frequent at the bar where Celestine worked. No longer confined to his private booth, he chose the corner by her station, where the polished mahogany countertop seemed to provide a fragile bridge between their worlds. Patrons who glanced at him saw only the usual elegance, the tailored suit and confident posture, unaware of the subtle cracks that had begun to show. Celestine, however, observed everything: the way his gaze lingered on her hands as she prepared drinks, the micro-expressions that revealed unspoken thoughts, the slight hesitations that suggested he was thinking in multiple layers at once. He began to speak, first in fragmented stories, then with a cautious, almost hesitant openness. His words traced back to his sister, Juliana, and the burdens she had carried quietly for years. She had struggled with depression, a condition her family had struggled to understand. Vincenzo described the silence that had surrounded her pain, the moments when his attempts at comfort had been inadequate or misinterpreted. As he spoke, the refined poise that had always defined him wavered subtly, replaced by something more vulnerable. Celestine listened, committing each detail to memory, noting the contrast between the man who ruled an empire with an iron hand and the brother who had loved deeply yet often been helpless. The narratives extended to their mother, whose death when Juliana was 16 had cast a long shadow over the family. Vincenzo recalled the cold efficiency with which his father dismissed grief and weakness, labeling emotional struggle as a flaw. It had shaped him, forged a need for control, and instilled a discipline that bordered on obsession. Celestine understood, in ways her training had not prepared her for, how trauma had intertwined with power to create the man she had always observed at a distance. His habits, once subtle, became more pronounced. He aligned bottles with geometric precision, counted exactly 4 ice cubes in a glass of water, tapped his fingers in sequences that mimicked Morse code, rhythms that had once seemed arbitrary but now hinted at a methodical mind seeking control over the uncontrollable. Celestine noticed the effort he invested in these small rituals, the way they seemed to soothe him when the weight of his empire pressed too heavily. The awkwardness beneath his refinement became impossible to ignore, the discrepancy between the calculated elegance of his public persona and the quiet, sometimes uncertain gestures when he was near her. It drew her in, the human contradictions adding layers to the image she had carefully maintained in her mind. Their conversations shifted from family to him. One night, after a particularly long shift, he admitted, almost reluctantly, "I cannot stop thinking about you." The statement, simple in words, carried the weight of months of suppressed vulnerability. Celestine felt a conflict she could not name. Her analytical mind warned against engagement, yet her instincts acknowledged the intensity of his attention, the way it pressed against boundaries she had long considered immutable. In another instance, he disclosed a lapse in judgment at work. A shipment had been sent to Milwaukee without proper verification of the recipient. He admitted it was a distraction caused by her presence in his thoughts. It was a confession that blended business and personal stakes, a subtle intertwining of two worlds that had remained separate for months. Celestine's pulse quickened. Her training suggested caution, emotional detachment, yet the raw honesty of the admission forced a reckoning with feelings she could not contain. The dynamic between them evolved into a series of measured proximities. Each encounter contained an electric tension, a gravitational pull neither could deny. When he sat at the bar, She sensed his vigilance softened, the rigid boundaries that dictated his interactions with the rest of the world relaxing just enough to allow a connection to form. Their dialogue became an intricate dance, questions posed, answers revealed, observations shared without explicit acknowledgement of the unspoken magnetism between them. Celestine observed how he handled the duality of his existence. In public, he remained the imperious Don, commanding respect, maintaining discipline. Privately, in the corner of her bar, he revealed the careful balance of his mind, the oscillation between ruthless efficiency and an almost fragile sensitivity. It was a careful negotiation of trust, one that required precision on both sides. Each time he let his guard drop, she catalogued it, measuring the weight of disclosure against the boundaries she had erected for self-preservation. Despite the intensity of her observations, she could not suppress the personal impact. His vulnerability, juxtaposed against the power he wielded, drew her deeper. She noticed the subtle twitch in his jaw when recounting moments of family failure, the faint tremor in his fingers when handling delicate items, the pause before his eyes met hers, calculating how much of himself he could expose without losing control. She was witnessing a man capable of extremes, love and cruelty, tenderness and calculated precision, and it resonated with her in ways her logic could not fully parse. The interplay of proximity and restraint, confession and observation, created a tension that was both thrilling and perilous. Each shift, each conversation, each acknowledgement of his presence became a test of boundaries and desires. Celestine found herself increasingly attuned to the rhythms of his behavior, noting deviations, adjustments, and subtle signals that hinted at an emerging pattern. The precision that had once intimidated her now fascinated her, revealing the human impulses that existed even within a man of meticulous design. By the end of the month, the rhythm of their interactions had shifted irrevocably. Celestine was no longer merely the observer, she had become an active participant in the delicate negotiation of his attention. Every glance, every measured word, every shared detail about his past and present created a lattice of connection neither could fully articulate. The boundaries she had maintained were tested repeatedly, and the gravitational pull between them grew stronger, insisting on acknowledgement. It was clear to both of them, though neither would articulate it fully, that their dynamic had changed. What began as observation, as professional distance, had evolved into a complex web of human vulnerability and desire. Each meeting, each shared story, each unspoken moment advanced them toward a collision of emotion, thought, and instinct. The foundation of their relationship, built on secrecy and careful engagement, was solidifying, even as the risks and stakes loomed beyond the bar. In those weeks, Celestine recognized a truth she could no longer ignore. Something had begun between them that could not be contained, quantified, or dismissed. It was dangerous, magnetic, and irreversible. The delicate balance of control, observation, and personal involvement had shifted, leaving them both on the cusp of something that neither logic nor training could fully explain, yet both could feel with undeniable clarity. 3 days before Christmas, snow fell steadily along the alley behind the Velvet Serpent. The flakes landed silently on dumpsters and wet pavement, sticking to the edges of her black uniform as Celestine Monroe approached the back entrance. Each breath condensed in the cold air, mingling with the faint smell of exhaust and the sharper tang of winter dampness. She should not have been here. Every instinct screamed caution, yet her feet carried her forward. Vincenzo Caruso waited, leaning against the wall just outside the steel door. His tailored suit was streaked with slush, the edges of his coat darkened by melting snow. His eyes, the gray she had studied from afar for months, locked on hers in a way that bypassed the usual layers of distance. There was no arrogance, no performance. Only presence, raw and immediate. When their lips met, it was a collision of restraint and desire. The kiss was consuming, urgent, and unrelenting. It pressed against all reason, forcing them into a shared gravity where judgment held no authority. Celestine felt the tremor of vulnerability in him, the man who ruled empires with precision and fear, now yielding to the force of an emotion he could neither control nor resist. She responded with equal intensity, her fingers threading through his hair, mapping the curve of his jaw, memorizing the heat of him against the cold winter night. Her mind screamed, cataloging every warning her life and training had impressed upon her. This was dangerous, illogical, even reckless. Another voice whispered that beneath the power and control, she had glimpsed his vulnerability. That vulnerability had pulled her into proximity she had sworn she would never cross. Conflicting impulses tangled with every heartbeat. Rules emerged immediately, unstated but clear. She would not enter his Trump Tower penthouse. He would not be seen with her in public. Exposure would mark her as a target. The gravity of his empire was not something she could challenge, and she understood the cost of any misstep. Yet in the privacy of alleys and quiet corners, an intimacy developed that was both fragile and intense, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, curiosity, and the dangerous thrill of forbidden closeness. Vincenzo began confiding in her. Not fragments or platitudes, but precise information. Names, dates, locations, and decisions made across his network of businesses and clandestine operations. Each confession was measured, as if testing her reaction, and she received it with careful neutrality, cataloging every detail while convincing herself it was for professional analysis. She told herself she was gathering evidence, documenting patterns, maintaining a detachment that her heart refused to honor. Her justification could not fully contain the truth. She was addicted to the moments of unguarded presence he allowed her. Being the only person who saw the real Vincenzo Caruso, the man beneath the meticulous exterior, was intoxicating. She recognized the dangerous power she held in this exchange, the knowledge that she could undermine his empire with a single decision, yet the temptation to influence him emotionally outweighed that fear. Each meeting, each confession, heightened the intensity of their connection. The air between them held the weight of unspoken possibilities and unacknowledged consequences. Celestine felt the gravitational pull of proximity, the thrill of intimate knowledge, the magnetic tension of sharing space with someone who could destroy the world around her with a single command. She also felt herself changing. Boundaries she had meticulously maintained were eroding, replaced by a curiosity and attachment she could not name without betraying her own caution. The snow continued to fall, covering the alley in a thin white blanket, muting the sound of distant traffic and casting the world in a quiet focus that belonged only to them. She sensed the inevitability of what was approaching, the convergence of their private confessions, desires, and vulnerabilities that would demand a reckoning neither could evade. There was no drama in the forecast, no sudden twist to signal its arrival. It was inevitable in the way a winter storm presses against the city, a gradual but unstoppable force shaping every surface it touches. She inhaled sharply, sensing the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his hands as he pressed his palms against her waist. Vincenzo's control, which defined his public life, had surrendered in the private sphere. And in surrender, he had created an uncharted space between them, one filled with risk, intimacy, and the latent power of secrets shared between two people who understood the stakes. Celestine realized, as she met his gaze, that they were both tethered by something neither of them had planned but both could feel, a bond forged in shared exposure. He had allowed her access to his truth, and she had absorbed it, body and mind, reshaping her understanding of him. The balance of power, once so absolute, had shifted in subtle ways, leaving them both precariously poised on the edge of what was possible. The kiss ended reluctantly, but it left the alley charged. Snowflakes clung to their coats and hair, indifferent to the quiet revelation of intimacy. The moment carried weight beyond the immediate physicality, an acknowledgement that their connection had moved beyond observation, beyond caution, into the territory of mutual vulnerability. Celestine's heart raced, not only from desire but from understanding the magnitude of what had just begun. It was the beginning of a dangerous descent, a path lined with choices that could alter both their lives irreversibly. Each subsequent meeting, each whispered confession, would bind them closer, entangling trust, desire, and danger in ways that could not be disentangled. She felt it with clarity. This was not a temporary shift, a fleeting thrill. It was a movement that would carry them into darker territories, demanding decisions that neither preparation nor morality could fully contain. The rain fell in sheets over Chicago, turning streets into rivers of reflection. The alley behind the Velvet Serpent was slick, neon signs melting into the puddles with every flicker. Celestine pulled her coat tighter, the cold mixing with the urgency in her chest. The city felt restless, as if aware of the violence moving beneath its surface. Detroit had made its move. A rival organization had struck at one of Vincenzo Caruso's warehouses in Cicero, leaving 3 of his men dead and sending shockwaves through his network. Messages had traveled fast, unspoken but understood. Retaliation would not be measured. It would be absolute. Celestine approached the basement entrance, her hand hovering over the cold steel handle. Every step down the stairs was deliberate, measured, knowing that what awaited below was not a scene for the faint-hearted. The smell of wet concrete and iron hit her first, followed by the low hum of fluorescent light that illuminated the basement's far corners. Vincenzo stood over a man tied to a chair, knife in hand. The captive's pleading eyes met hers as she froze, the weight of the room pressing against her ribs. Vincenzo's expression shifted when he noticed her presence, but only subtly. His cold composure remained, though his eyes flickered with acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that she was witnessing something few had ever seen. "You should not be here," he said softly, the words carrying both warning and the barest trace of vulnerability. "No, I shouldn't," Celestine replied, her voice steady even as her stomach clenched. She took a careful step forward, choosing to face the reality of this man fully. Choosing to remain present in a world that demanded fear and distance. Choosing him. The captive stammered, begging for mercy, his voice cracking against the weight of inevitability. Vincenzo's knife glinted in the overhead light as he moved with methodical precision, a predator executing a necessary, brutal task. Celestine's eyes met his briefly, and in that instant, she saw the duality she had come to know, the ruthless king who commanded obedience through fear, and the man who had opened his vulnerabilities to her in quiet corners, confessing his doubts, regrets, and human frailties. Her heart raced, the adrenaline mingling with a conflicted admiration. She understood, in ways no outsider could, that this violence was not born of cruelty alone but of control, necessity, and the unbending logic that governed his world. Yet, knowing this did not soften the reality, it only clarified the stakes. Each decision he made carried consequences, some immediate, others far-reaching, and she was witness to the most immediate of those consequences tonight. Vincenzo's movements were deliberate, every gesture measured. He leaned forward, listening, watching, maintaining control even as chaos lingered in the room. The captive whimpered, the sound sharp against the otherwise quiet basement. Celestine felt the weight of her own presence, understanding that she was a silent participant. Her decision to stay to observe was not passive. It was active engagement in the raw, undeniable power of this world. The tension in the air was absolute. Celestine's mind raced, cataloging, assessing, yet also absorbing a deeper truth. The man before her operated with a code, one she would never fully understand, yet one she had come to respect in its strictness. This was the measure of Vincenzo Caruso, unyielding, exacting, and lethal when necessary. The attack from Detroit had already set in motion consequences that could not be ignored. Orders had been sent, networks had been alerted, and every action was a step toward retaliation. Celestine felt the gravity of that process in every flick of Vincenzo's knife, every controlled movement, every measured breath. It was the reality of his empire condensed into a single, rain-slicked night. Her decision to advance closer was deliberate, a physical acknowledgement of trust, risk, and alignment with the man she had chosen to see in full. She was not naive, she understood the dangers, the potential for loss, the sharp edge of consequence. And yet, she remained. Observing did not make her powerless, it made her witness to the choices, the weight, and the cost of power wielded without hesitation. When the immediate confrontation ended, the captive subdued and silent, Celestine recognized the truth of her position. She had seen the monster, the strategist, the man who balanced empathy and authority with a precision few could comprehend. Yet, she had also seen him defer to her presence, acknowledge her as more than an observer. That recognition, small though it was, marked a shift in their relationship, a subtle acknowledgement of trust and the danger that trust implied. Rain continued to pound against the alley above, muting the city outside, while inside the basement, consequences had been executed and decisions had been made. Celestine felt a mixture of fear and understanding. She had entered a world governed by rules she could not bend, outcomes she could not predict, and a man whose power could not be challenged without cost. And she had chosen to stay. The reality of the Caruso empire pressed in from every angle: the threat from Detroit, the lives lost, the networks mobilized in retaliation. But for the moment, the basement was a crucible of clarity. Vincenzo's eyes met hers one final time before he turned to attend to the next task, and she understood. Her presence was not a disruption. It was a bond forged in shared comprehension of necessity and consequence. In that moment, she felt the weight of every decision, every action, every choice that had led her here. Choosing to witness, choosing to stay, choosing him. The violence, measured and absolute, had revealed the full spectrum of the man she had come to know in quiet moments. And it left her with no illusions. Love, desire, and loyalty carried a cost in Vincenzo Caruso's world. A cost she had accepted, fully aware, willingly. The basement settled into silence after the immediate threat had passed. Every object, every shadow, every space seemed charged with the reality of what had occurred. Celestine exhaled, grounding herself, knowing that tonight had cemented more than understanding. It had cemented choice, commitment, and the acknowledgement that there was no turning back from the path she had chosen alongside him. The basement had emptied, leaving only the lingering tension of decisions executed and fates determined. Celestine stood near the stairs, absorbing the quiet aftermath. Her hands were steady, her breath controlled, but inside, every thought raced. She had seen the full measure of Vincenzo Caruso, the man who commanded fear with the precision of a surgeon, the man who could extinguish lives with a glance, and the man who had allowed her to see the fissures beneath his meticulously crafted exterior. She could have left. Any rational instinct would have demanded it. She had witnessed the monster, the consequences of his power, the lives he had the authority to take or save. Logic dictated retreat. Fear dictated escape. But she did not move. Her feet remained rooted, her mind circling a different understanding. Love does not follow logic. The heart does not obey conscience, and the human capacity for connection often bends under pressure where reason fails. In the days that followed, Celestine processed her choices, questioning the depth of her attachment and the wisdom of her resolve. She recognized the darkness within herself, the part that resonated with his intensity, that understood the thrill of proximity to danger, that felt the magnetism of a man who demanded both respect and surrender. She acknowledged it without shame, noting that the recognition of her own impulses gave her clarity, not weakness. Their relationship shifted almost immediately into negotiation, each interaction a careful balance of influence and boundaries. Celestine articulated her first demand with precision: the human trafficking operation must end. She framed it not as an ultimatum but as a moral line she would not allow to be crossed in her presence. Vincenzo listened, his expression carefully measured. He did not reject the demand, he considered it, processing the implications of compliance against the mechanisms of his empire. Within days, the women and children who had been trapped within his network were relocated to legitimate refugee services, shielded from danger, and given paths to safety. Celestine's second demand was more complex: exit the opioid distribution network. She understood that dismantling supply chains was a task of time and strategy. Vincenzo agreed, outlining a methodical plan that would take months to implement. He remained the same calculating strategist she had come to know, but he allowed the operational changes to take root, trusting her judgment and acknowledging the lines she drew. By the following December, the Caruso family had fully exited the pharmaceutical trade, leaving only legitimate ventures as the public face of their wealth and influence. Throughout this process, Celestine maintained self-awareness. She did not harbor illusions of reforming him, nor did she believe she had transformed the empire overnight. Her work was subtler, deeper. She was making him less destructive, carving spaces of morality into a world that otherwise rewarded ruthlessness. Her influence was not redemption, it was mitigation. In the quiet moments when they sat across from each other, sharing details of past losses, future ambitions, and the vulnerabilities they rarely disclosed to anyone else, she understood the delicate balance between loyalty, love, and consequence. Vincenzo adapted in response to her presence. He no longer carried out operations with the same unchecked disregard, aware that Celestine observed, questioned, and held him accountable. Yet he did not weaken in authority. The empire maintained its integrity, its efficiency, and its ruthlessness when necessary. He had learned that power and restraint could coexist, that the presence of someone who challenged him morally could strengthen rather than diminish his control. Celestine's role was equally complex. She became more than the invisible bartender or the outsider who merely observed. She was an active participant in shaping the limits of his influence. She navigated the tension between affection and ethical oversight, her intellect and emotional insight guiding conversations, decisions, and interventions that preserved life without compromising the structure he required. Every directive she offered was measured, deliberate, and aimed at creating sustainable change within the constraints of reality. Their conversations often stretched long into the night, mapping out the operational transition, discussing potential threats, and reflecting on past errors. Celestine discovered a rhythm to their partnership, one that blended strategy with intimacy, danger with trust. Every decision carried the weight of consequence, but also the subtle reward of mutual acknowledgement. She would not leave, and he allowed her presence to influence his actions. In these interactions, the lines between personal desire and operational oversight blurred, creating a partnership both fragile and resilient. By the end of the year, the landscape of the Caruso empire had shifted. The shadows that had once loomed over innocent lives were diminished. Vincenzo's wealth and authority remained intact, his empire secure, but its human cost had been tempered. Celestine recognized the nuanced truth. She had not changed him fundamentally. She had not altered the nature of power itself. She had, however, imposed a framework of accountability that reduced suffering and created space for humanity to exist within an empire built on control and influence. Her awareness of the stakes never faded. She knew every choice came with consequences, that love within this world carried risk, that proximity to power required vigilance and courage. Yet she stayed, acknowledging both the danger and the depth of her commitment. The negotiation of souls was ongoing, iterative, and deeply personal. It required constant attention, moral clarity, and an acceptance that influence was not synonymous with transformation. In the quiet aftermath of every decision, Celestine measured her success not in absolution but in lives spared, in operations rerouted, in moments where choice had replaced inevitability. She understood that the man she loved was not pure, and neither was she. They were partners navigating a landscape of compromise, consequence, and moral complexity. This understanding did not diminish passion or connection. It enhanced it, binding them together with shared responsibility and mutual acknowledgement of risk and desire. Through this process, Celestine realized the essential truth: love does not conform to expectations, nor does it demand the impossible. It thrives in the space between imperfection and intent, between darkness and accountability. Her influence was neither absolute nor final, but it was real. And in this recognition, she found both clarity and purpose, understanding that choosing to remain in this world was an act of agency, courage, and deliberate engagement with the complexities of power and human connection. A year had passed since that night in the basement, and the rhythm of their lives had shifted in ways neither had anticipated. Celestine no longer moved through the world as the invisible bartender. She carried herself with quiet authority, her presence both commanding and precise. The intelligence in her eyes had sharpened, tempered by the lessons of choice and consequence. She had learned how to navigate danger with clarity, how to assert influence without compromising her own moral compass. Her evolution was visible not only in the way she conducted herself within the Velvet Serpent, but also in the subtle power she held over the decisions Vincenzo made. Vincenzo, too, had changed. His empire remained formidable, but its edges had softened where Celestine's influence had pressed. He maintained control with the same precision that had once terrified everyone around him, yet he had begun to measure actions against their human cost. The shift was not in morality. He had not become innocent, but in awareness. He recognized that power without responsibility invited ruin. In her presence, he had discovered a rare equilibrium, the ability to preserve authority while acknowledging vulnerability, the paradox of strength enhanced by trust. Their connection carried an undercurrent of tension. Loving someone whose hands would never be clean was a constant negotiation. Celestine confronted the moral complexity head-on. She knew that compromise and survival were intertwined, that affection for Vincenzo did not absolve his past, and that proximity to him demanded perpetual vigilance. Yet she remained, understanding that intimacy was not built on perfection but on shared acknowledgement of flaws and consequences. They often met at dawn along the shoreline of Lake Michigan. The sky, pale and shifting with early light, framed the still waters that reflected both clarity and uncertainty. In those moments, words were often unnecessary. A touch, a glance, the weight of presence conveyed trust, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of the lives they carried into the world. They had seen each other's worst, the fractures that defined them, yet remained committed to the connection they had forged. Their intimacy was less about passion than about bearing witness to each other's complexities and choosing to remain. These mornings offered clarity that other hours could not. Celestine reflected on the nature of love and consequence, realizing that attachment was not redemption. It did not erase mistakes, cleanse guilt, or provide easy absolution. It was instead a force that demanded courage and insight, a lens through which to confront the paradoxes of human connection. Love, she understood, cut both ways. It could elevate, inspire, and transform, yet it could also bring vulnerability, exposure, and the risk of destruction. The measure of choice was found in awareness and acceptance. Vincenzo and Celestine spoke of the empire less in concrete terms and more in the language of restraint, boundaries, and shared objectives. Each decision carried implications for lives touched by their power. They discussed future plans with attention to consequence, businesses to expand, ventures to maintain, boundaries to enforce. Even in moments of routine, the weight of their responsibilities remained present, an ever-present reminder that the world they inhabited demanded vigilance and deliberation. Despite the persistent dangers, their partnership flourished in subtle ways. Celestine's presence altered the rhythm of Vincenzo's life. He confided, shared, and allowed insight into operations without compromising authority. Their conversations blended strategy with honesty, negotiation with intimacy. Both understood that influence was reciprocal. She shaped his choices, and he shaped her understanding of the world she inhabited. The dynamic was delicate, demanding constant attention, but it had created a resilience neither had anticipated. By observing and participating, Celestine honed the art of discernment. She recognized patterns of behavior, tendencies of decision-making, and points of leverage that allowed her to maintain agency. In Vincenzo, she saw a reflection of her own capacity for strength and risk. Their coexistence was an ongoing exercise in balance, each learning how to navigate danger, desire, and accountability without losing sight of the other's humanity. Through the year, the empire had retained its reach, and lives once endangered were safeguarded. Vincenzo's authority remained intact, yet the culture surrounding him had shifted. Where previously fear had dictated obedience, there was now respect tempered with cautious understanding. Celestine's influence had created a space where decisions were measured, consequences acknowledged, and human cost mitigated without diminishing control. In the quiet moments at the lake, Celestine reflected on her own choices. She had entered a world defined by extremes and survived intact, not by hiding but by acting with awareness. She had chosen the man, the life, and the consequences, eyes wide open. Awareness had been her guide, and in it, she found clarity and purpose. She understood that love did not promise salvation, nor did it guarantee transformation, but it demanded presence, engagement, and moral acuity. Their final understanding was not simplistic. It was a recognition that human relationships, especially those forged in proximity to power and danger, were complex and multidimensional. Love required risk, demanded honesty, and thrived in the acceptance of imperfection. Celestine and Vincenzo had navigated darkness and choice, vulnerability and authority, and emerged with a connection rooted in deliberate awareness. Celestine's reflection carried both satisfaction and acceptance. She had seen the full spectrum of Vincenzo's nature, had understood the reach and cost of his power, and had remained. She had chosen to engage with the consequences fully, to confront complexity without retreat, to stay present even where clarity offered discomfort. Her eyes were open from the beginning, and that awareness had guided every step of her journey. The story closes with acknowledgement. The world they inhabit offers no simple answers, no easy paths, but it does allow choices made with intentionality. Celestine had chosen to stay, and in that choice, found her power, agency, and understanding. Love was not redemption, and life was rarely neat, but the deliberate embrace of reality provided clarity and meaning where illusion offered only fleeting comfort. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our content. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story that does not give easy answers. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories to this channel. We will see you in the next one.